Hi, it's Jim Mullany from Wine Consultant Crew Cellar Management, and today I'm going to share with you 3 tips for blind wine tasting. This follows the first Sommeliers Australia blind wine tasting in Victoria that we had recently, where we had 4 blind wines that were tasted, 2 whites and 2 reds. There was a lovely Albarino from Rías Baixas in Spain, a Viognier from the Eden Valley here in Australia, and then there was a German Spätburgunder or Pinot Noir and a Nebbiolo from Barbaresco. Those wines were highlighting contrasts. In the whites, it was a contrast in acidity between the Viognier and the Albarino, and in the reds, it was highlighting the difference in tannin levels between that Spätburgunder or Pinot Noir and the Nebbiolo, which is known for having higher tannins. So let's start with the tips. The first tip is to channel your inner Roger Federer. Roger Federer, of course, was the world #1 men's tennis player for a very long time, but surprisingly, he only won 54% of the points that he played. And the takeaway of this for blind tasting is, when it comes to blind tasting, even if you're a competent taster or the best taster, you're not always going to get it right. And that's okay. The thing that you really want to be focusing on is getting the characteristics of the wine right in your assessment, and then drawing a logical conclusion grounded in theory as to what the wine might be. And I'll give you an example. Here I have a lovely Chablis from well-known producer Vincent Dovissat. This is 2018 vintage. Now imagine we were tasting the Chablis blind. What sort of things might we see? I would expect that there would be a lovely high acidity reflecting Chardonnay grown in this cool climate. Also, a light body, absence of oaky characteristics such as overt vanilla, aromas and flavors. And also, in terms of the aromatics and the flavor profile, I'd expect to see citrusy or green fruits and floral characters like blossom. Now, just say you were tasting this wine blind and you observed that it had high acidity and a light body and an absence of oak and those typical green and citrusy and floral aromas. But then you made a conclusion that the wine was an Albarino. That's a pretty fair call, because Albarino is a great variety that also shares those characteristics. And so while you've got the wine wrong, you've been right in your assessment of the defining characteristics of the wine, such as that high acidity, and then you've made a logical conclusion. It just so happens that you haven't got it right. But really, when you're blind tasting, your focus should be on, did I notice those key characteristics in the wine in the glass, or did I miss them? So in the case of this Chablis, did you say high acidity, or did you miss that and maybe thought that the wine had lower acidity? And then, were you logical in your conclusion as to what the wine was? If you were, but you got it wrong, it's unfortunate, but it's a good result, and that's what you should be really focusing on. And that's consistent with what we're seeing at the WSET, or Wine and Spirit Education Trust, and Master of Wine, where often in the tastings, in the exam, there are still substantial marks available for your assessment of the characteristics of the wine and the reasoning for your conclusion as to where you think the wine is from or what grape variety it's from. So in other words, there still may be substantial marks available in your answers in the MW or WSET, even if you get the wine wrong, because your assessment of the characteristics of the wine has been correct and your conclusion has been logical if incorrect. So keep that in mind. It's a little bit like maths questions in exams, where often there'll be substantial marks available for your calculations, even if the end answer is wrong. So channel your inner Roger Federer. You're not always going to get it right, but you want to be right in assessing the characteristics of the wine and being logical in your conclusions. The second tip for blind wine tasting is to practice regularly. It's a little bit like learning to play the piano. They say that you're better off to practice a little bit each day than leave it, say, to the end of the week and have just one long session. And the reason for that is by doing it more frequently, you're developing muscle memory, which helps you to become a better player quicker. And it's similar with blind wine tasting. The more frequently you do it, the better and more effectively you will develop that muscle memory, let's say, in your palate, and calibrate your palate to pick up on nuances in wines so that you are better able to determine what the wine might be. So if at the moment you're doing blind tastings, let's say once a month with a group of friends, I would encourage you to try and do it more often than that, let's say once a week. And that might mean that when you're out at a restaurant or a wine bar, asking them to serve you a wine blind so you can practice, or tasting something at home and writing a tasting note blind and seeing if you get it right. So the more that you taste, the more frequently you do blind tasting, the better you will get at it, and you want to be consistent as well. Finally, the third tip I have for tasting wines blind is to focus on the structural characteristics of the wine that you are tasting. This is a more reliable indicator than, say, the aromatics and flavours of the wine. And this was a tip that was shared to us at the Sommeliers Australia Education Scholarship last year, where a number of the judges on the expert panel shared with us this point. Focus more on the structure of the wine than the aromatics. The aromatics may be helpful, but they can also mislead. So let's think about the Barbaresco that we had in our blind tasting recently. That, of course, is from the Nebbiolo grape. And if you focused on the structural characteristics of that wine when you tasted it, you would have noticed that it had high, firm, chalky tannins, mouth-watering acidity, and warming alcohol. All of these are consistent with the Nebbiolo grape variety. It's a grape variety that's known for its high acidity and high tannins, and when grown in Barbaresco or Barolo for that matter, it can often show high alcohol. So that warming alcohol sensation on the back of the palate was consistent with it being Nebbiolo. It was consistent with being Barbaresco. So focus on the structural characteristics first, and based on those structural characteristics, use that to draw a conclusion of what the wine might be. It's not that you have to forget about the aromatics, they can still be helpful, but put that focus first on the structure. And if I think about the Viogna that we also tasted in the blind tasting, that was a wine that showed relatively low acidity when compared to the Albarino next to it, although it was still quite an energetic example, but it did have lower acidity. And also it had quite a generous, round and weighty mouthfeel. Viognier, of course, being a grape variety that is known for having relatively low levels of acidity and that generosity on the palate. So both of those structural characteristics were consistent with the grape variety. And by focusing on that, it would be logical to come to a conclusion that it was in fact Viognier that you were tasting. The aromatics in that wine were also consistent with Viognier. It had an exuberant nose with ripe apricots and a lovely floral jasmine character. So that could also help inform your decision making, but the point here is to really focus on the structural characteristics first. Colour, of course, can also be helpful. Like in the case of the Barbaresco, that had a pale colour, a pale ruby colour, which is consistent with Nebbiolo, which is a grape variety that doesn't give much colour and is often pale. So yes, aromatics and flavours can be helpful, and also colour, but when you're blind wine tasting, focus on the structural characteristics first, and then you can look at the other things secondly, but use the structural characteristics as a guide. And if I just go back to that Barbaresco just once more, by focusing on the structural characteristics, I could exclude the possibility of the wine being a Pinot Noir or a Grenache. Even though it had a lovely red perfumed nose and pale colour, both of which are consistent with Grenache and Pinot Noir, the high, firm, chalky tannins ruled them out, because Pinot Noir and Grenache have lower tannins, and so it just wasn't possible, or very unlikely, that it would be either of those two grapes. So by focusing on the structural characteristics, I could eliminate some options and then I would have a smaller grouping of grape varieties and wine regions to think about to determine what the wine in the glass might be. So the 3 tips for blind tasting today are to channel your inner Roger Federer. You're not always going to get the wine right when you taste them blind, even if you're a very accomplished and competent taster. What you want to focus on is assessing the defining features of the wine. You want to be able to notice them, like in the case of Chablis, its high acidity, its light body, the absence of oak. You want to be picking up those when you taste the wine. And then you want to make an informed and logical conclusion grounded in theory as to what the wine might be. If you get it wrong, but your assessment of the characteristics was right, and your conclusion is thoughtful and logical, that's still an okay result. Second tip, to become a better blind wine taster, taste wines blind frequently and consistently. The more frequency, the more frequently that you do it, the better you will get. And thirdly, when you taste wines blind, focus on the structural characteristics of the wine first. Give that the greatest emphasis and the greatest, focus your attention on that first, and then you can think about the aromatics and flavors and the color as well, but really focus on those structural characteristics first. Thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you taste a wine blind soon. Thank you.